How's it going, and welcome to No Fun Allowed, and today I wanted to give my final thoughts on The Wild Beyond the Witchlight. This delightful campaign's got a lot of ups and several downs, and I wanted to go over those things. So of course there is going to be a ton of spoilers so players don't watch this, but DMs don't want that added insight. Go ahead and stick around because I've got some things to talk about. So what a campaign, what a ride, what a thrill. This campaign, it truly is a fun roller coaster kind of campaign for me. I really like the linear path that it presents, but at the same time, it's not totally rigid. While yes, you are absolutely moving in a certain direction, there's a lot of stops along the way, and those stops are absolutely incredible. So, starting off here with the structure of this whole book, we get this intro, and the intro says, hey, your characters need to have two things. Either one, they are going into the Prismere because they need to find something that was lost to them, or they're just working for some warlock, and this is just a regular D&D quest. Regardless of how that happens, you take these characters to this carnival. And all of a sudden, you're not even playing a typical adventure anymore. You're going to a carnival where you're riding on rides and playing in games and doing a whole bunch of fun, wacky things. And that is so different from the regular level 1 style play. If you compare level 1 to every single one of the other 5e adventures, which by the way, I've done a video on all of the level 1 adventures, my goodness, most of the level 1 adventures suck. Not purely because of the way they're written, but just because a level 1 character can't do much, and if you get hit once, you're down, and that's the end of the story. But thankfully, because of this little scenario here, you hopefully shouldn't be getting into any combat. Mind you, of course, you can get into combat if you really want to. If you've got a group that really likes combat, then power to them, I guess. But typically, we don't see that many people getting into combat. Of course, I've seen a lot of great revisions on ways you can incorporate some sort of combat into the Witchlight Carnival, and I've seen some great ways on adding some foreshadow and foresight into the rest of the campaign. But purely as written, of course, it typically doesn't happen. Now, the thing to consider is, while I do like the Witchlight Carnival, and it introduces a great concept of doing things here that apply to the rest of the adventure, at the same time, there's a lot of just emptiness in the fact that you do a bunch of these things, and at the same time, it doesn't actually incorporate into the rest of the adventure. While yes, you do get some quests that pertain to the rest of the adventure, like you get a quest to find a lost cub, and you get a quest to find a missing brother, and things like that. At the same time, you typically don't get too much info about what's going on. You can get some info about the Coven, you can get some info about Prismere, but it's not that much really, and your players are essentially just going to Prismere blind. Which is perfectly fine, mind you. As soon as they get to Prismere, that's when the adventure truly starts, but it is what it is. What I do like, though, as mentioned before, is the fact that if you go to the Gondola Swans and you get into a conversation, then boom, all of a sudden that helps you with a skill check later. You do the snail racing and boom, you can have an advantage on animal handling, stuff like that. That is something that needs to be done in future things. In fact, actually, I think that's what backgrounds essentially should have been, because backgrounds in 5e suck. Backgrounds are completely forgettable and worthless. I think backgrounds should have been something like that actually pertains to an adventure. So maybe we'll see some sort of revisions like that in the future. Regardless, Chapter 1 of the Witchlight Carnival is fan-freaking-tastic. And then, of course, we step on through, and there we get to Prismere. Prismere is an absolute delight. When you go to Hither, it feels like a swampy, terrible, nasty place. And then you go to Bavlorna's cottage, and the place sucks. But then eventually you move over to Thither, and it feels like a wooded area filled with mystery. And then you go over to Yon, and it feels like a mountainous region. You go to the Palace of Heart's Desire, and it feels like a palace. It feels the way it's presented. And that is something very important, because oftentimes there is some adventure areas that are basically a thing, like a forest or a swamp or a desert or whatever, but it doesn't make it feel like that. Thankfully, due to what is presented here, it does present that feeling. When you're in Hither, you're dealing with a whole bunch of nasty water, and you're dealing with swampy creatures, and you're dealing with things of that nature. When you go to Thither, you're dealing with woodland creatures. When you go into Yon, there's lightning striking all over the place. It feels the way it should, and that's really, really good. Now, in regards of how the structure of this story is presented, I think it's fine. Something to consider is this adventure was written with the idea that you can get into no combats throughout the entirety of the campaign. It was written with that idea. Now, does that actually work out? What's funny is actually pretty much right away in Hither, you get jumped by some people, and unless you literally submit or you pass a skill check, which is pretty easy to fail, then you are going to get into combat. In which case, that kind of defeats the whole purpose. I think they should have held off a little bit after, maybe you should wait a little bit before you get jumped by the rabbit folk there. But at the same time, obviously you as the DM, you can do whatever the heck you want. I'm always going, basing my review off of rules as written, right? So while you can go through this adventure without any combat, I seriously doubt many groups actually do a pacifist run. In fact, I know some people have. I've seen it on the Discord when my buddies ran a game that was a full pacifist run. It's definitely doable, but much like anything, right? You can always do an easy pacifist run. What I suspect is most groups are going to get into minimal amounts of combat. What I suspect is most groups maybe get into 2 combats, maybe 3 for each section on average. That's what I suspect anyway. Because some of the random encounters usually dictate for the air quote average group that you get into a combat. If you bump into some people that demand something, players never want to give anything up unless they fight. So you go into Hither, you get into some fights there. You go to Thither, you get into some fights there. But most important of all is the dealings with the hags. What really makes this game truly stand out is the fact that, much like another big adventure that everyone seems to love, Curse of Strahd, there is a clear central villain, or in this case, several villains. And the fact that they're present and right there and able to be talked to, negotiated with, right there, and most important of all, they have a reason to not beat you up immediately, that leads to a lot of fun dynamics. How do your players approach these villains? Do they work alongside them? Do they coerce them? Do they subterfuge them? Do they beat them up? Do they, there's so many different possibilities. And that truly does dictate the entirety of the adventure and the grand finale. And that grand finale can be just an absolute blast depending on how your players have gone about setting up all of these situations they're in. So boom, right there. Your players may be killing the hags and thus they just, make the ending super easy. Or maybe they use some subterfuge and thus all the hags are right there at the end and they finally have to deal with it, but they're a lot stronger now. Maybe your players get a whole bunch of allies and the allies join in. There's so many different ways. Oh, it's so freaking good. What I'll say, though, is while you have these villains that are just great, the Coven, we've also got the B villains here, and that is the League of Malevolence. So in Hither, we get no semblance at all that there's this League of Malevolence. And then in Thither, there is the possibility that your players deal with Zorak, and maybe they beat him up there, but they may not have any inclination to. In fact, my group didn't. My group just saw Zorak attack a unicorn, they're like, maybe we shouldn't deal with that. And then, boom, all of a sudden, they don't really learn that much info. And then also at Loomlurch, your players may not actually free the Valor's Call member. It's possible. Once again, my group didn't do that. I think it's perfectly reasonable that most groups actually don't free the Valor's Call member at Loomlurch, because maybe most groups don't deal with the hags right away. And if you don't deal with that, then you've got a Valor's Call member missing, and you also don't learn more info about the B villains. And then you go to Yawn, and then you meet another one of these people, but once again, you may not learn anything, right? It's just a combination of things where, depending on your player's strives for interacting with NPCs, whether they go out of their way to press for a whole bunch of info, or you have to just lore dump them, that's really going to dictate how much they know about the potentially major villains of this campaign, the League of Malevolence, right? And so maybe it could have been spread out a little bit better. Maybe there could have been some Valor's Call mixed with League of Malevolence every which way. and maybe one in hither each, one thither each, one yon. Maybe it could have been spread out like that, but regardless, it does lead to a pretty epic conclusion of the Palace of Arts Desires because your players can just beat them up all right there, or maybe they, once again, use some sort of coercion. Maybe they just say, hey, Warduke, we got a whole bunch of gold, work for us. And then boom, you got Warduke on your side. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Now, the B villains have a tiny bit of foreshadowing, but the C villain, the Jabberwocky, has next to nothing. There is a random encounter in Thither, which makes you find some Jabberwocky tracks, but you probably don't even know that they're Jabberwocky tracks. You don't even know about the Jabberwocky's existence, really, until the grand finale. And that's really bad, because the Jabberwocky is potentially one of the most dangerous of all the villains in this campaign. Yeah, the hags are tough. Yeah, Valor's Call is tough. But that Jabberwocky, if your players don't know about it, that's a game over, man. Your players just all of a sudden get Jabberwockied, and that's the end of the story. So I definitely think there could have been a little bit more foreshadowing there as well, but once again, is what it is. Now, all of the 3 locations, hither, thither, and yon, feel thematic, feel fun, feel unique, but which one do I think really stands out? That's a tough one. I think that they all stand out in their various ways, but I think that yon is just so great because you've got these warring factions which are kind of warring for no reason, and you can settle the beef, or maybe you just go in and deal with it yourself. You've got these Fey beacons, and it's almost like a parable of someone eternally trying to free themselves, but they can't do it on their own. And then Motherhorn is such a great hag lair. Motherhorn is so fantastic. It's, this great castle, and there's plays being played all the time, and everyone's miserable, and it's so great. I love it. I think Yon is just such a great standout. Not to say that hither and thither are bad, it's just that I really love Yon and its themes there. Of course, I think that the true standout here of all of the locations in Prismeer is the Palace of Arts Desire. The fact that they fit so much awesome dungeon into that location. They fit so many NPCs in that location. They fit so much fun little puzzles and intricate encounters and things of that nature in this one castle. It is so fan-freaking-tastic. You can run that thing as a one-shot. It works well. You can run it as, nice little dungeon crawl, almost like Castles in Talan. That is so freaking great. As I mentioned in the beginning, this adventure does have its ups and it does have its downs. The ups here are the roleplay. We get so many NPCs, so many, both named and even unnamed NPCs, that really make this place come to life. Because if I show up to a Fey location, I want to interact with goofy, weird, wacky, awesome characters. And this delivers it. Even though this place has been subjugated by a whole bunch of hags, guess what? All these NPCs are still kicking. They're still thriving. And even the ones that are working for the hags are still fun to roleplay. The hags themselves are great to roleplay. Both of the protagonists, the antagonists, the neutral characters all throughout are great to roleplay. And we get so much detail about each one. We get little NPC cards, and we get their ideals, bonds, flaws. That right there really helps sell making a livable world. The fact that there's NPCs and you can easily look at them real quick, understand their motivations, and you can roleplay them effectively. It works so well. And not only that, but also having a whole bunch of people that are willing to join the party. I always recommend that PCs get forms of followings, retainers, henchmen, things like that. Because, one, not to DMPC, never DMPC, but having a slew of people that are willing to follow the party based on their actions informs the players of their deeds. If you see that, oh, hey, I've got this little scarecrow-looking dude walking around, why do we have that? That's because we're moving forward. It's because we're making progression. And every time you ever bring up, okay, you got this little scarecrow-looking dude behind you, then that reminds you players of their actions and of their deeds. And if any time they ever want to roleplay with them, you can immediately start roleplaying as them. That's great. I had so many NPCs attached to the party in this campaign. I think at the grand finale, I think they had maybe 10 or 11 NPCs joining alongside them because They just always love collecting a whole bunch of goofy, wacky characters. In Hither, they got Clapper Claw, and they got Morgort the Knight. In Thither, they got a Goblin, and then they got Squirt the Oil Can, and then they also got the Owlbear, and then, the list just went on and on and on. And I absolutely love it for that. The NPCs are amazing. So that's one pillar of the D&D aspect here. Now, what about the exploration? So exploration does mean a number of things in our games, but how does it feel to explore around this world? As written, this is not a hex crawl. As written, this is not a major, mega dungeon sort of thing. This is, in fact, a point crawl. The game directs you that, okay, the first location that the players go to is here, and then they go from X to Y to Z, and in between you can roll some random encounters. In which case, the exploration is somewhat lacking, yes. But at the same time, it makes sense, right? They want to make this adventure simple. They want to make this adventure very streamlined. And in that case, of course, there's also the fact that you can't really go from hither to yon. You have to go to hither, and then to thither, and then to yon, and then to the Palace of Heart's Desires. There's no breaking the sequence here. But if you do allow for a sequence break, then it's also bad because then it's super underleveled, right? So the exploration of the overworld is lacking, yes. But what about the exploration of the locations therein? Well, as we can see here, most places don't get maps. The only places that get maps are the Hag's Lairs, and of course the Palace of Heart's Desire. So there's a lot of space here, and we get this huge whole world, and we get barely any maps. In fact, I think this is the least amount of maps we've ever gotten for any of the 5e adventures since the very beginning, honestly. And that is unfortunate. But at the same time, there's a reason why they didn't print that many combat maps, because they didn't want to regulate and enforce having combat. Having combat maps implies that you're having combat. If you don't have combat maps, that implies that you're not having combat. It is what it is. The exploration at the Hag's Lairs is great because depending on how adventurous your players are, whether they're making deals with the hags or they're sneaking around or they're bashing their way through, they can find some great goodies, but only if they're willing to push themselves. If you have a group that is passive, that does not negotiate with the hags in a way to allow them for some freedom, or if they are not willing to engage in combat with the hags and their minions, then they will not be able to explore that much, and that is unfortunate. That being said, though, for the minimal amount of exploration we had all throughout the land of Prismeer, the grand finale, we get the Palace of Heart's Desires, and that is an amazing dungeon to explore around in, amazing location to explore. It has got so many different rooms and different puzzles to solve, and it's absolutely great, and it's an absolutely memorable experience if you've got a group that loves that style of dungeon delving. So to that degree, the exploration is hit or miss, but at the end, it pans out very well in one big go. And lastly, of the three pillars, we're on to combat. As mentioned, combat is optional. But the thing is D&D is a combat game. I know I see a lot of people say, oh, D&D doesn't have to be combat, this and that. But the thing is you can pick up any role-playing game system and not do combat, right? The whole point of picking up a role-playing game system is you use the rules that you're presented. So you use those rules. Does this campaign work if it is a combat fest? No, unfortunately not. If you pick up this game with a bunch of people that love to get into fights with every single thing you come across, then I think that this campaign just doesn't work out well. There is a lot of decent combats to be had here, and there's a lot of interesting NPCs to combat. There's a lot of fun locations to be having combat in, but at the same time, it just doesn't work because you're supposed to be interacting with all these NPCs in a more meaningful manner. There's a lot of fights that are potentially extremely lethal early on, and even later on, I guess. Combat, I think, is definitely supposed to be used sparingly, not overused. That being said, if you have a group that, as I mentioned, if you get into combat maybe twice or 3 times in every single location at the most, then I think it's fine. I think the combat works okay. I like the combats with the characters being meaningful, and to that degree, they can be meaningful. When you fight the hags, those are extremely meaningful fights. If they succeed, then they can free some population and make their lives that much easier later on. And if they fail or the hag gets away, then they learn more things. The combat can be meaningful. And at the same time, there is also some repercussions thrown in there. Like, there's actually a whole section there on if a PC dies, what happens, or any character dies, what happens. So that's really cool to reference there. If someone dies, then there's a chance that they actually come back. So that's pretty cool. But once again, don't run this as a pure combat slog. It's just not going to work out well. Run it as adventurers adventuring to save the day, or potentially join up with the bad guys at the end, I guess. Regardless, just combat all over the place. I just don't think works well. Now, the real question is, does this all pay off? Does exploring around this location, meeting with all these NPCs, and combating your way through, is it a satisfying reward? Honestly, that's honestly the sad part. I think that the grand finale there, we see, okay, what happens? What are your rewards? What do you get? I think that's kind of lacking. It really doesn't lead into too much. After you're going through this whole location, you're saving all these people, you fight the hags, you free Zybilna. Do you actually get everything that you wanted? I mean, you get a wish, but is a wish good enough to get what you want? What do you want out of this campaign? What do you want from this adventure? What do you want the grand finale to be? We see in a lot of other adventures that the grand finale is saving the world and saving the world and saving the world. We see that a lot. So what happens when you go on an adventure where you're not saving the world? How do you get a rewarding climax to the grand adventure? It has to be personally rewarding. And to that degree, it can be. If you came here to find something that was lost, then unfortunately you probably already acquired what you already lost. In which case, then, what are you actually doing, right? If you came here to free Zybilna, then, job done. You freed Zybilna. The real reward should be freeing all the friends that you've made along the way and ensuring that Prismeer has a bright and happier day. And I think it doesn't go into that enough. I think there should have been like some nice little epilogue there that had all of the NPCs and what happens afterward and all that fun jazz. I think there should have been more of that. And I think that it also should have included about going into other Prismeer lands, maybe some other Fey lands, working for Zybilna. I think there should have been a lot more to that. But at the grand finale here, I'm just going to show off here, ending the story. It says, yeah, all the bad guys get shunted out, and you get a wish, and one of your wishes is you can be a kid again. Here's the thing. While I understand that would work well in a movie, people coming back, I guess like Jumanji style, how many people would willingly become a kid again and go through puberty? Not very many people. I don't think that many people would willingly become a kid again. That would just suck. So, is what it is, right? But regardless, I think that the ending can certainly be great. You've just got to drum it up yourself, though. You have to personally show off all of the great deeds and hard work and reward them accordingly. Instead of them just getting the meager reward of a few random items from some warlock's chest, they need to get these, boons and have powerful friends in powerful places. If you want to have future campaigns, it is so easy to work in this whole idea of going to little lands in the Fey realm, going to domains of delight, and working alongside or underneath Zybilna. So many great ways you can go about approaching that. My final thoughts on this campaign is it's great. It's honestly one of the more well-written ones of all of the 5e lineup. It took a long time for them to realize that 5e is being ran a certain way, so they should write adventures to be ran a certain way. 5e was originally written with the idea that people do X and Y, but in reality people are doing Z. People aren't running the game as it was originally intended, and that's fine. It just means that you're going to have to shake things up. People love to roleplay way more than they do combat. Most people, anyway. I know a lot of people like combat, yes. But I know that the majority of people out there like to roleplay. So make an adventure that's got roleplay. Make an adventure where you're not going out to save the world for the umpteenth time. Make an adventure where you're not globetrotting and you're just going and exploring a tiny little location. This adventure fulfills that need. And I'm willing to bet that if this thing succeeds and does well, they're going to write adventures similar to this. What we do know is that Wizards of the Coast is going to be writing shorter adventures because they've seen that doing things like Candle Key Mysteries and Tales from the Yawning Portal and Ghosts of Saltmarsh is, one, easier, but two, it just fits with a lot of campaigns because you can fit tiny adventures into a large campaign a lot easier than you can fit a grand adventure into a campaign. So, is what it is. But I do suspect that they're going to realize that people like this style of play. I know it's not going to be for everybody. Some people want the hack and slash style. Some people want saving the world. Some people want the heavy combat. But we'll have to see. The results are going to speak for themselves. Do people enjoy the combat side of the game more, or do they enjoy the roleplay side of our hobby more? That is going to dictate where the future is. What I'm here to tell you is that this is a good adventure if you are into that role play and you're into that intrigue and into players subverting big bads that are standing right there in front of them. And if you love having a tiny little world filled with a whole bunch of crazy nuance and intricacies and a whole bunch of fine detail, this works well for that. But if you're looking for an adventure where you're saving the world and killing all the bad guys and doing all that regular D&D adventuring stuff, then unfortunately this is not the one for you. So I think that this adventure is extremely good, but what are your thoughts? What are your final thoughts on this adventure? Have you ran it completely yet, or are you beginning to run it? Have you not run it at all? I want you to tell me your observations of this campaign, because a lot of people are going to read these things differently. Some people are going to perceive how to run the monsters a certain way. Some people are going to observe that they should run this encounter a different way. I want to hear those things because this adventure is truly unique in that even though it is a super linear adventure, it has such a wide variance at that grand finale. I want to hear how your campaign is going to shape up. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. And thank you to my amazing patrons. You guys are absolutely incredible. Thank you so very much. And I cannot wait to see you all in the next one.